Well, nice, nice. Welcome everybody to my YouTube channel again. We have a lesson here from period 4. I've combined a couple of concepts here because I want to talk specifically about the market revolution. But I've always felt like the War of 1812 fits nicely in here because in many respects it's a catalyst to this thing. One of the greatest revolutions, I think, in human history is about to happen. New innovation is coming, westward migration, creation of markets, giving people the opportunity to move from the east to the west, and it will spark a whole manifest destiny from this point on. But let's talk about some things that came before. Let's go back to our good friend Alexander Hamilton. He had created the first bank in the United States, trying to establish a line of credit for America, a single bank that would oversee all the other state banks, oversee currency, like I said, oversee the nation's credit. Men like Jefferson and Madison, though, argued that this hurt the common man. You had all these wealthy investors who were investing in the bank, and we weren't considering the farmer. We weren't considering the veteran of the American Revolution. Many veterans, they had tried to speculate in land, but land prices fell. And so some wealthier men came in and bought up those as speculation. They bought up their continental dollars as speculation. Madison himself would argue that when prices go up, we should sell it and give the money back to the original owners, those veterans, those farmers. Where Hamilton and his guys would argue, no, that we now have a nation of men who are willing to risk their money to invest. If we're going to sell that, it should stay with them. So we talked about the division of political thinking. And one of the causes is financial. Hamilton and his Federalists are looking at a strong national identity that's based on manufacturing, that needs to be protected. Our industry, our growing industry, needs to be protected with a strong bank system, protective tariffs. And Jefferson, Madison, and their Republican Party are always going to try to fight for the common man. Well, we know Madison, he wins out in 91. And what happens, since this is an entity that will work with the government, it gets what's called a charter, right? A legal document that the federal government says you can exist, but only for 20 years. So you have your 2 terms of Washington, you have your 1 term of John Adams, then you get 2 terms of Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson decides not to run for a 3rd term. He does what Washington did before him. And when Jefferson does that, he solidifies that tradition of a 2-term president. And now at this time, remember, it's only a tradition. It's not a law yet. That's going to come much, much later in history. So he won in 1800. He wins in 1804. He decides not to run in 1808. So James Madison will run. It's during his term of office that the charter comes up for renewal in 1811. And surprise, surprise, the Jeffersonian Republicans are completely in control now. We talked about that election of 1800. It was a bloodbath for the Federalists. There's only a handful of these men in Congress and in the Senate. So when it comes up for renewal of that bank, the Republicans are saying, no, we don't need this anymore. This, again, is an extension of the abuse of federal power in their minds and their thinking, and they let the charter run out, and so the bank simply ceases to exist. Now, why do I bring that up? Because it's going to be very important to the story here. Because the very next year, we're going to be at war. So here we are in Key Concept 4.1.1a. It's the early 1800s. National political parties are continuing to debate. And of course, ... there's more to this concept, but I want to focus on relationships with European powers. The Federalists were always pro-England. Last time you watched one of my videos, you saw the whole Embargo Act. right? Jefferson, the whole thing of impressment, and we had the Chesapeake incident. Jefferson decided to stop trade with all of Europe, which Federalists controlled New England states, Massachusetts primarily, trade heavily with the English, and they see the embargo as an abuse of constitutional power, further dividing the political parties and the political thinking. But you're going to constantly have the problem with also France and with England. The Republicans want to constantly honor what they think their older ties with the French, who helped during the American Revolution, but that government no longer exists. It's been gone for quite a while. And now Napoleon is the ruler of France. But the English continue to be a problem. They're at war with the French, and they began to do more and more harassment of the seas. We know a lot about impressment. They've amped up their game with impressment. Their whole thinking is that these American sailors were formerly British. And they come up with that idea that then you're deserters of the British Empire, and that's what gave them the right to take our sailors and force them or impress them into their navy. So that's a problem. That's been going on since George Washington and the failed Jay's Treaty. You also have this Orders in Council takes place. England, during its war with France, Napoleon basically conquers the continent of Europe. And so the English control the Atlantic Sea. They control much of the Indian Sea and the Mediterranean. So they order these Orders in Council. They block trade on the European continent, trying to financially choke Napoleon. But it created a lot of animosity in Europe. The League of Neutral Nations is formed. I actually think it's the Second League. You've got Denmark and the Netherlands. You have Russia is not going to be happy with this. So there's going to be conflict with those European nations. But it's also going to eventually lead to conflict with the United States. So you have impressment taking place. American trade is being stopped because of Orders in Council. And the constant arming of Native Americans. There is a war that started in 1809 known as Tecumseh's War. Talk a little bit more about Tecumseh in class. In fact, remind me to talk about Tecumseh. Very, very important Indian, Native American during this time period. Him and his brother, known as the Prophet, they'll raise a massive confederation of Indian tribes and go to war with the United States. The war comes to an end in 1811, so just before the War of 1812 breaks out. But all of this is culminating with Americans at this time. You got to remember, we're about a generation away now from the American Revolution. The American Revolution is 1775 when it started. So you've got nearly, 30, 40 years have gone by. You've got young men now in what's known as the 12th Congress who were either too young when that war started or they weren't even born yet. And these younger men in Congress, such notable men that we're going to be talking a lot about, John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, Daniel Webster of Massachusetts, and Henry Clay of Kentucky. Clay is someone we're going to talk a lot about. This is your first introduction to Clay. Talk a lot about him today in this lecture and a lot about him throughout the course now. They are now young hotheads for war. They're known as war hawks. They feel like the English have totally humiliated us and they're going against American honor. They begin to press for war. 1812 is a re-election year. Think about that as well. James Madison is up for re-election. He can see that his party is calling for war. He doesn't want to lose an election, so he's going to come that summer of 1812. The Constitution does say the President of the United States can inform members of both houses of Congress on important matters of the State of the Union. So he draws up a war message. So in his thinking, well, if this Congress wants to go to war, and they're the only ones allowed to declare war, the president should be the one who then leads and gives the reasons for it. And he begins to list all of these things here that I've just talked about. And Congress declares war on England at a time period where we don't have really much of an army, pretty much a joke of a navy, And there's still a lot of discontent in America. Remember, we're the disunited states as well. Plus, wars cost money. And just the year before, they got rid of the Bank of the United States. So now you're going to rely on state banks to help fund this. You have to raise an army. You have to feed an army. You have to clothe an army. You have to arm an army, right? You have to provide provisions. You have to pay said army. I don't really like to get too much into the War of 1812, except I feel it's so important for this market revolution moment, because America industry will actually benefit from this. Canning industry starts to emerge. Canning food for those soldiers, clothing them, interchangeable parts with Eli Whitney. Eli Whitney will get a government contract by showing members of the military how you can take 10 muskets, take it apart, take them all apart, mix them up on a table, and then put them all back together exactly the same. We no longer are going to rely on blacksmiths to make our weapons, that once that weapon breaks, you got to go get a whole new musket. Now you can just get interchangeable parts. That's going to be a massive catalyst for the market revolution. Industry, like I said, like canning industry, textile industries, those things are going to explode because of this war. Technically, to me, this is a war that maybe America, at best, is a draw. I mean, in the beginning, there's a lot of humiliation for America. The Capitol is going to be set on fire. The White House is set on fire. Congress is set on fire. The Library of Congress is set on fire because Great Britain invades Washington, D.C. Of course, it is a retaliation for when Americans got into Canada. They did set on fire the Canadian capital, so I guess it's retaliation. And they lose some other battles. But towards the end of the war, it should be noted America began to win battles, especially on the Great Lakes. They build ships and they fight a naval war on the Great Lakes. And America begins to win that one. And Henry Clay, who I mentioned earlier, along with John Quincy Adams, are going to go to Europe, and they're going to negotiate for a peace because Napoleon has been defeated. England doesn't want to keep going to war. That costs a lot of money for them as well. And you're going to get the Treaty of Ghent is going to happen. And that's important because, remember, there's no telegraphs, there's no telephones, there's no computers. All this takes a lot of time. We're also going to find the treaty is signed, and about a month later, Andrew Jackson, who we're going to start talking about a lot here, he is a general, and he wins this famous battle at the Battle of New Orleans, which were against British dragoons. The best of the best that had just fought Napoleon now go to New Orleans, and Andrew Jackson beats them there. Why am I talking about that kind of stuff? Because what is also extremely important here is the Federalist Party. See, the Federalists have holed themselves up in their states, and they're not happy. Can you hear my dog? Somebody must be knocking at the door, and he is going nuts. And I'm not going to stop and redo this, so we'll just listen for a few moments. This might be a good time to take a little snack break. I have a nice glass of iced tea here. I always encourage breaks. I'll just wait till you come back, and maybe my dog stops barking. Uh-oh. All right, I guess it's good now. So, the Federalist Party. They've been very upset over a lot of what's been happening to this country. They feel that the Republican Party now has completely abused their constitutional powers. With Jefferson's purchase of Louisiana, they felt that was abuse of constitutional power. His Embargo Act was an abuse. They think this war is an abuse of constitutional power. They have figured that they could probably use this as a way to start getting back into popularity with the rest of the country. So they're going to meet up in the New England states, in Hartford, if you know anything, that's in Connecticut. Now there's a small group of them that began to talk about secession. And that becomes an issue. right? A group of them are now going to talk about secession, like they can leave the country. That's not going to happen. They talk it, but the rest of the Federalists say no to this. There's also a group of them who are going to be known as Blue Light Federalists. These were the Federalists, if you remember in that Embargo Act cartoon, they were the ones that were illegally smuggling with the British. They're going to continue to do that throughout the war. They'll use blue light lanterns at night so that the British can land on the shore and they can trade with them and perhaps land some troops. So they're committing acts of treason. Now they meet in December 15th of 1814. That's when the Treaty of Ghent is signed in December of 1814. They meet until January 5th, 1815, so they do not know that the war is over. They also do not know that, as we mentioned earlier, Andrew Jackson's won the Battle of New Orleans. But they think they've come up with a good thing. They're going to come to Washington, D.C., which is still smoldering from being burnt to the ground, and they're going to have a list of grievances that they feel they can rally public support on their side. They feel the federal government should give them financial support for all lost trade, all the way back to the Embargo Act. That this Constitution should have an amendment to it. You should always get a 2/3 vote if there's going to be a war, a 2/3 vote if a president wants to enact another Embargo Act, and a 2/3 vote whenever a new state wants to come into the Union. They want to get rid of the 3/5 clause, right? Because they realize now, again, some of these guys are probably a little bit on the abolitionist side, but most of them are thinking about the political power the South has because of the 3/5 clause. They also want to create a law that says presidents can only serve one term, and consecutive presidents cannot come from the same state. Because you had Washington was Virginia, then Adams was Massachusetts, but then Jefferson and Madison are now from Virginia. So they're trying to break up this Virginia dynasty. All of this is going to backfire on them. They're going to come to Congress and they're going to stand before Congress and list these grievances. Now remember, the Capitol building was set on fire. So actually, if I remember right, they're meeting in a hotel. And in the balcony, James Madison came to hear them. And people say you could hear him start to laugh as they were listing these grievances. This will doom the Federalist Party. They basically, at this moment, they've committed political suicide. They're going to cease to exist.
Aha!
Yes, exactly. And yeah, it's just all over for them.
Oh.
Yeah, sad for them. But they did it to themselves. They'll run a candidate in 1816, but it's really all over for them as a political party because of this particular moment. But now let me get into why the War of 1812 is very specific for the market revolution, but it's also going to polarize the political parties even more now. This is the moment when now those Jeffersonian Republicans are going to emerge as Democrats. And it's right there in our concept. 411C, the Democrats now are led by Andrew Jackson. And eventually a Whig party emerges led by Henry Clay. That doesn't all happen overnight. That's going to take some time. There's still Republicans in 1816, but it's starting to happen at this moment. You're going to see they're going to continue to fight over the National Bank because that bank, look at here, it's going to come back. All right, we're going to talk about that in a second. Tariffs are going to go up again. We're going to start having high tariffs to protect industry. And this idea of federally funded internal improvements, which becomes the cornerstone of the market revolution and Henry Clay's vision for the United States. It's in 4.2, Roman numeral 3, letter D, where they give the name the American system. That's what this is known as. That's Henry Clay. Henry Clay will come to call this the Great American System. But it started in all unlikely places with President James Madison, a states writer, a devout Jeffersonian, right? Because those two are best buds. The war has come to an end. and he's going to give what is called the annual message, but in our time it's the State of the Union. The annual message is always given at the end of the year in December. Today, the State of the Union is given at the beginning of the year in January, but it's the same thing. We're going to look at this in class. We're going to look at just 5 or 6 excerpts from this particular message to show just how powerful this really was. This guy who was touting states' rights begins to think about things after that War of 1812. And he began to see the country is starting to modernize. So he calls on a uniform national currency, right? One currency for the whole country. He realizes the only way you can do this, that bank that he himself allowed to go away, we got to bring it back. So they chartered the second national bank of the United States. They chartered it in 1816. So that means it should stay around to 1836, but it ain't going to quite happen. And we'll talk about that much later. We get our first protective tariff in American history, raising taxes on trade to protect American industry. Plus, that gave the federal government a lot of revenue, a lot of money that they could use for internal improvements. He called on internal improvements. He said we start building roads in America. We start building canals in America. These are the things that will connect us and make us a real nation. And Henry Clay is going to take this, and for the rest of his political career, this becomes his thing, this American system. He's also going to do much for this country to try to keep us out of a civil war. We'll talk about that later on as well. So staying in these concepts, just give you some outside information. So the National Road, or sometimes called the Cumberland Road, began construction in 1811. It's going to stretch out of what today is West Virginia. It's going to cross Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, and to Illinois. The original thought was to get all the way to Missouri, to St. Louis, Missouri, to connect the East to what then was the far West. Henry Clay is going to be a very prominent figure for a long time in our political landscape. Henry Clay puts a bill before Congress where Congress appropriations is money. The government has money. Whenever they're going to spend it, they go to an appropriations committee to do this. They came up with $100,000. This created jobs, all right? That's what Henry Clay is thinking. They're going to construct a road made out of rock. They're going to take rocks and pound them down into small pebbles. It's a system I think they took from the French. And it's smoother, it's easier, and travel now goes faster. You're still on a horse, you're still in a carriage, or maybe you're walking, but you no longer have to go through the woods. Right? You no longer have to do any of that. What's going on here? Stop that. Oh, well, whatever. And men like this. But what's starting to happen now are other Republicans who are feeling Thomas Jefferson and feeling this idea of states' rights. Now, James Madison signed this bill. He saw nothing wrong with it. Of course, this is the end of his 2 terms. And there are going to be men within the Republican Party who are going to say, this is wrong. This is wrong. And other men like Clay, who's in the Republican Party, are going to say, this is right. And eventually, this party gets split. Clay becomes a national Republican who starts to envision a unified America. The idea of building not just infrastructure, but also national colleges, an observatory, which John Quincy Adams will also tout when he's president of the United States, because he also becomes a national Republican. Then other guys begin to say, this is against states' rights. This is against what Jefferson preached. And they begin to call themselves Democratic Republican. And this is where that party eventually is going to split. Lake Erie Canal, which is this picture you see here, it still exists to this day. Considered one of the greatest engineering feats in this entire nation, when a time period where the science of engineering and the school of engineering does not exist yet, Americans rolled up their sleeve and said, let's build a canal that connects Lake Erie to the Hudson River. And in class, I'll try my best to show it to you in this e-learning world that we're in. Once you start building roads and once you start building canals, there's an old movie that said, if you build it, they will come. If you build it, they will come. Once I start building infrastructure to get quicker to the west, people start to come. And when people start to come, that creates all kinds of opportunity that did not exist yet. And a modern America is going to now emerge. Key concept 4.2, innovation is coming, not only in technology, but also in agriculture. In the north, we have grains and wheat and corn. This is farming that is simply by farmers. We are not using slavery here. So technology is going to improve agriculture. Commerce becomes a very powerful thing in America. Trade, the American economy will grow. Right? There are all kinds of, as it brings in here, profound changes to our society, who we are as a nation, who we are both nationally and regional. It changes our thinking on things. Every once in a while, there's these big impetus that happens in our history that over the 10, 20 years, you can see changes in our culture and how we think of ourselves. And this was definitely one of them. We're going to get a whole transportation revolution. We're going to get a communication revolution out of this. And there it is in letter A, this market revolution. But entrepreneurs were the driving force, men who were risk takers. And I have a story to tell you when we're in class about a very interesting situation of a risk taker that you have never heard of before. And what that will lead to changes over not just decades, but over more than a century. Right? When these entrepreneurs begin to take risks, without them realizing it, they'll create industries that will emerge 50, 80, 100, 150 years down the road because of the risks they're going to take in the 1820s, 1830s. This idea of the consumer and the producer emerges. You and I are the consumer. So now they're going to start making things because of mass production is going to happen and all sorts of things, and it's going to create a consumer society. We are now people who like to buy stuff. We like to go places, although we can't really go anywhere right now. But and it's going to be funny how this video will play out a couple of years down the road. We'll still see how it's going on. Innovation comes. The textile machineries, textile machines, they innovate them. They make them better and faster. The steam engine, we steal that from England and it comes over here and we make it better, and interchangeable parts. The telegraph, all these innovative things. And I have these examples down here. Robert Fulton, an American innovator. He sees the potential of a steam engine. And this is a true story. Robert Fulton will first take his ideas to France. And he'll get a moment where he's able to actually have an audience with Napoleon. And he shows Napoleon his designs, that he could build Napoleon a fleet of ships that are not dependent upon wind. He will put steam engines on them. And Napoleon basically will say to him, "Begone, you dreamer. I have no such time with men like you." That's one of those moments in history, one of those great what-if moments. If Napoleon would have said, let's build a massive fleet of steam-powered boats, how the whole history of the world could have changed at that moment. Robert Fulton will come back to America, and he will get funding, and he will sail down the Hudson River in the early 1800s on a boat he calls the Clermont. Now, he put sails on the boat just in case it didn't work. But you can imagine as people are picnicking along the Hudson and they see this thing chugging down the river without sails. It changed the way we thought about everything. Within a few decades, that steam power will be applied to railroad. Eli Whitney comes in the late 1790s. He will get patents for the cotton gin, and then a few years later, a patent for interchangeable parts. Now, there's a lot of controversy with his cotton gin. He is not from the South, he's from the North. He's a lawyer, but he was going to a business arrangement with a friend of his in Georgia. When he comes down there and he saw slavery, he saw him picking cotton, he began to muse, wouldn't it be interesting if we can build some kind of machinery that can make it easier to clean cotton? Because it took one man an entire day to clean just 10 pounds of cotton, because cotton has a lot of seeds in it and dirt in it and things that have to be physically taken out. Turns out there's a slave on this plantation who was thinking the exact same thing. And I lean on the side that Eli more than likely stole the idea. He sits with the slave. Within just a few hours, they come up with a cotton engine. So that's why it's called a cotton gin. Gin is short for engine. But it was more than likely the ideas of a slave, or maybe they did collaborate, but then he gives them zero credit for it. But his original thought was this could help alleviate slavery. We don't need as many people now to clean cotton, but it has an adverse effect. When Southerners saw now we can clean up to 100 pounds of cotton a day with just one guy, and if I've got 20 or 30 guys, now I need more slaves, and I need to have more land to plant more cotton, which means more slaves, and then they need to go out there and harvest cotton, which means more slaves. So unfortunately, the cotton gin has a very adverse effect on slavery. And of course, Samuel B. Morse and his telegraph. Morse did not invent Morse code. And at some point in class, remind me about that, and we'll talk about that as well. But all these great innovations are coming now. And Congress, at first, is going to back it up, like with the National Road. They're going to appropriate $100,000. You're going to have the Marshall Court. So the Supreme Court's going to be on the side of the federal government for about 30 years. All this is going to promote roads and canals and railroads. It's going to enlarge markets. It's going to foster regional independence. So there's a lot right here. Transport networks, communication networks, everything that you think about modern America today in the 21st century, its foundation is built during this market revolution. The other thing is the role of women change. Here we are in 4.2, Roman numeral 2, letter A is the first one, B and C. Increasing number of Americans, and especially women, now are getting these factory jobs. The rise of what's known as the wage laborer is upon us now. Men by the hundreds of thousands and then by the millions are going to get these factory jobs in the canning industry, in the iron industry, in the textile industry. Multiple industries are now emerging that will employ so many people. This is creating jobs. This is creating the idea of, well, now I can earn these living in a way that my father never thought of before. We're no longer going to be semi-subsistence agriculture people in the North. We can now have markets. I can go to grocery stores and get what I need. I don't have to grow in my backyard. I don't have to have a cow in my backyard. All this starts to change. But I put in here the example of the Lowell factory girls. Mr. Francis Lowell was an entrepreneur. And before the War of 1812 broke out, he went to England to look at their factories and look at their textile industries, and especially this thing called the loom, one of the greatest inventions of mankind, and basically steal their ideas. But then the War of 1812 broke out and he could not leave. He was basically under house arrest for a while. But he eventually comes back as the war comes to an end, and he shows investors his idea to build these massive factories with not only textile machines, but this new thing called the loom. And he has an idea. He wants this great, this cultural experiment, this social experiment, if you will. Let's hire women to do the jobs. Now, he'll die before this actually gets started, and they'll name the town after him, Lowell, Massachusetts. and they'll honor his wishes. And you have to understand, this was done in a very specific way. The young women who will be hired will be treated like you're in college almost. They'll build dormitories where the women all live. They'll hire what do you call it? Women to be like headmistresses, I guess is what you call, not a headmaster, but to oversee the women. They'll bring in cultural activities for them to take. They'll build libraries so they can read. They'll teach them about economics. They'll teach them how to have their own savings account, their own checking accounts. A lot of education is actually going to take place here in the very beginning of this. There are diaries of a lot of these women that exist to this day who talked about a sense of freedom and self-worth. Think back to the last thing we talked about with women was the Republican motherhood. That idea that they were eventually going to get their opportunity to get more involved in the political landscape. Well, that never happens, right? Eventually here in letter C, instead you get the separation of public and private spheres between men and women, which becomes known as, and that's outside information, cult of domesticity. Men begin to think that women should stay home. They should stay home and raise families, and men should participate in the market revolution. There were many men who were against the factory girls. That will last a little more than a decade, and eventually many of those women will be supplanted by Irish immigrants. The Irish immigrants will come and eventually take most of these jobs. But it was a beginning for women. A lot of these things are also happening in the market revolution. Market revolution starts a lot of stuff. Then we're also going to talk about a big religious awakening is going to happen because of the market revolution. The market revolution is also going to bring about reform in America, which will eventually lead to abolition. And because of such things like this, with women now having a little bit more say economically, and when those other reform movements come, all that will coalesce together, and a suffrage movement in 1848 will begin. So yes, this whole situation, this market revolution to me is one of the most fascinating moments in American history. We'll take some deep dives in classroom over this. And yeah, you'll have some notes. Remember, from now on, we're moving to an idea of taking thorough notes on my video logs. And we'll talk more about that in class as to how you can upload that to Canvas and get your grade for it. All right, everybody. Hopefully this wasn't too long for you. Have a good evening.